When I got the call from Chief Justice O'Connor asking me to serve on the task force, I didn't immediately say yes. And the reason was because we were prohibited from discussing what I think is the ultimate question, which is, should you have a death penalty? And that was clearly off limits as part and parcel of the discussion that this task force was to have. And for me, and for my clients, and my office represents over half of death row, that was a hard decision. Should I be part of something that wasn't going to get to the question that I thought was most fundamental? At the end of the day, however, after much consultation with people much smarter than me, I ultimately decided that service on this task force was too important to pass up, that anything we could do to move the death penalty to at least a more fair application was a worthwhile endeavor. And as a result, I accepted and joined the task force, which spent over 2 years evaluating the death penalty. And I want to share with you some of what we know about the death penalty and some of the recommendations of the task force and why we arrived at them. But I think it's important to echo some of what Abe started with, and it starts with the wrong questions. People react to the death penalty very viscerally. They react to it and only answer the end question, should we have it? And they talk about things, well, what do you do with the Boston Marathon bombing? What do you do with the 9/11 bombers? What do you do with Oklahoma City? What do you do with that level of evil, if you will, that level of harm? How can there be any other answer than to put somebody who commits that act or any one of those atrocious acts other than to put them to death? And the problem with getting to that and using those as examples are that you skip the fundamental question of, do we have a system that can fairly and accurately impose that kind of punishment? Do we have a system that we have faith in? Do we have a system that makes sense? Do we have a system that you can sit back and say, we've got the right answer? That we can be satisfied not only that this person is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but they committed one of the most heinous crimes, and that as a result, we should impose this ultimate punishment. And you have to back up and start talking about what we know, because the charge to our task force was to examine the Ohio death penalty statutes and determine whether they're just and fair. And if not, what can we recommend to make them more just, more fair as possible? That was our charge, without going to that ultimate question, which actually was really interesting, and I'll share this story very early in my talk, which was on the second meeting of the task force, as I pushed for the collection of data, because it seemed to me if you want to answer this question, you're going to have to know exactly what we're doing with the death penalty in Ohio and how it's imposed and what's wrong with it, if there are things that are wrong with it. And at the second meeting, a person I'll leave unnamed looked at me and said, well, why do we need data? Why can't we just adopt best practices? Whereupon I returned to the first question and thought to myself, because best practices means we should stop having the death penalty. That's what every other state who's put a death penalty task force together has decided. The best practice is to stop. And we can get to that conclusion fairly quickly, but it's not one we're allowed to talk about. So we backed up. And I think it's important to talk about what is wrong with Ohio's death penalty. Why do these 56 recommendations come before you and hopefully before our legislature and before our Supreme Court and will become enacted? Because it is fundamentally important that we talk about this. Because at its core, I think when people talk about justice, what they mean is fairness. At its core, people have a very fundamental sense of fairness, and they want their justice system to ultimately be fair. Fair in individual application and fair in the broader scheme, in that 50,000-foot view, that the same crime, the same harm receives the same approach and same punishment, regardless of other issues. And the reality is the death penalty is the ultimate example of what's wrong with our justice system today. We have all kinds of issues that range from race to geographical disparities to value of life issues to juror bias to failure rates that are just extraordinary. And that doesn't get into cost issues or other issues that would militate against ever going forward with the death penalty. What we know when we sat down at the task force table, when we sat down, and this is the data we knew at that moment, in 1995, the Ohio Public Defender Commission, a 9-member board that ultimately hired me, thank you, found that you're 2 times as likely to receive the death penalty if the victim of the crime is white. Probably not too surprising to most people, but it tends to shut down conversations sometimes. They immediately say, well, you're accusing people of being racist. Perhaps. What I'm really doing is telling you that's unfair. Whatever the reason is, that's an unfair outcome. If your victim is white and it's twice as likely that you receive the death penalty, there's something wrong with that, and we need to address that. In 2005, because at that point when we sat down at the table, that data was now 15 years old, in 2005, the AP did a study and came in and reviewed all death indictments in the state of Ohio and reviewed outcomes and came to the exact same conclusion that 10 years later, the death penalty in Ohio still had a value of life problem. It still found that you were twice as likely to receive the death penalty if the victim of the crime was white. And in 2012, because the task force refused to collect data, and I promise you I tried. I tried. Every meeting, they got tired of listening to me. Can we do a data collection study, please? I took whatever funds we had in our office that we could afford to spend, and we did what data collection we could. I wish it were much deeper than it was, but we did collect quite a bit of data and broke new ground in some of the studies that we did. And so the Office of the Ohio Public Defender recreated much of this data in 2012 and found the exact same result. When you look at the death penalty, you are twice as likely, and our data actually found that it had gotten worse, that you're 2.5 times as likely to receive the death penalty if the victim of the crime is white. And so, as I've mentioned, you have a significant value of life problem. Is it okay in a justice system to say that whites are more valuable than minorities? And the answer has to be no. So you have to come up with recommendations that address that problem as much as possible. But that's not the only problem you come up with in the death penalty, because then you start to get to geographical problems. Ohio is a home rule state. And for those of you who aren't familiar with types of government, that means that we leave large amounts of power at the county level. Large decision-making authority is left at the county level, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. What is bad is that we don't directly or centrally report most data in Ohio, and that means that we don't know what's going on in the county level. But once you do dig around and you do find the data and you do bring together in a cumulative fashion, you find some very horrific numbers, which is that the death penalty is really, really inconsistently applied throughout the state. Prosecutors are fond of telling you, well, I represent the electorate, the people who elected me. So in this county, I'm representing the will of the people when I bring the death penalty. What that means in Ohio is you are 2.7 times more likely to be charged with the death penalty if you live in Hamilton County than anywhere else in the state. When you adjust for everything else, 2.5 times, a little more, to be charged in Hamilton County than anywhere else. Compared to other big cities, 3.7 times more likely than in Cuyahoga County. So if you're in Hamilton County, just under 4 times. If you're in Cuyahoga County as being charged with a death penalty crime. 6.2 times more likely to be charged with a death penalty in Hamilton County than in Franklin County, our 3 biggest cities. When you adjust for all of the differentials, all of the other equations that you can adjust for, you come up with numbers like that. And that one always makes me ponder, the value of life problem obviously has raised its head again. But I can't decide, does it mean Hamilton County values life more or less? Not sure. I guess it depends on which side of the charge you're on at that point. But what I do know is, again, it's unfair. And in response to the prosecutor's answers, well, I represent the electorate. So Joe Dieters in Hamilton County is very proud of standing up and saying, I represent the will of the people who elected me. And my answer is, no, you don't, Joe. No, you represent your personal opinion about the death penalty. How do I know that? I can go to Cuyahoga County. Cuyahoga County had a gentleman named Bill Mason as its prosecutor for years and years and years. Bill Mason liked the death penalty a lot. In fact, he was responsible at one point for bringing 60% of all death penalty charges in this state. By the way, Cuyahoga County only has 11% of the population. In 1 year, he brought more than 40 death penalty indictments. 40. Bill Mason left office about 2 years ago. It was about 2 years ago. Right after he left, Tim McGinty came into office. Tim McGinty's been in office just a little over 2 years. 2 years, if he represents the will of the people, the way Bill Mason claims that he did, the way Joe Dieters claims that he does, the way Ron O'Brien and Franklin County claims that he does, we shouldn't see a significant change in the charging pattern, should we? I mean, this is the will of the people they're representing, not their personal predilections. So we should have 80 so indictments under Mr. McGinty. How many have we had? 4. 4. The exact same electorate, the exact same people elected them, the exact same party representation. Nothing changed in Cuyahoga County. We didn't have some major shift in political power. We didn't have some major shift in anything. What we had is a change in the single person who makes the charging decision. So you have this huge geographical disparity across the state that is based upon the personal predilections of the person who's been elected the county prosecutor. And don't hear me wrong. I believe these people honestly intend to do what they believe is right, what they believe is the right thing. They are honest and genuine about believing that in most instances. Don't choke, Joe. They really do. Many of them really, most of them, all of them, really honestly, truly believe they're doing the right thing, but they're being, at a minimum, self-deceptive if they're telling you that they represent the electorate. They don't, not in this decision, and the data tells us that. Beyond controversy, the data tells us that. So we have that value of life problem, we have the racial disparity, we have the geographical disparity, and we're just getting started in problems with fairness in the death penalty in Ohio as it's been applied to, there are almost 150 people on death row today. Let's talk about juries. Juries are supposed to be representatives of the community, peers, correct? Well, unfortunately, there's this little thing in the death penalty called witherspooning. It's named after the case of Witherspoon. Witherspoon says that the only jurors who are in favor of the death penalty can serve on death penalty juries. Well, I guess if you want to have a death penalty, you're going to have that rule in place, because then anytime you got one person who said, I don't believe in it, you'd never have a death penalty. But it also means you eliminate any sense of fairness of a representative jury from this community coming together, because you have selectively said, I'm only taking this group of people who hold this belief. Maybe that's not so bad, but let's talk about people who hold that belief. What we know about people who believe in the death penalty, who are strongly in favor of the death penalty, who say, yes, I can serve on that jury, yes, I can hand down a death verdict, are far more likely to convict in the first instance. On any jury, they're far more likely to find people guilty. It's an interesting bias going in for somebody who's being charged and being defended for their life, to have to face a jury that's far more likely to convict them in the first instance. And it eliminates a really discrete sector of the community that the government claims it represents in favor of another sector of the community. It's chosen one side over another. It has said, we choose death penalty over non-death penalty. We value that view more. Another bias in our system, another unfairness. Witherspooning is by its very, very nature absolutely unfair. And then you have the outcome problem with the death penalty. Many people say it's like lightning, and that's probably true. Receiving a charge that includes a death specification is a lot like lightning, being struck by lightning. The odds are about the same. The rationale is about the same. There's very little sense when you look at crimes across this state that I can't find 10 murders that have very similar fact patterns that were never charged as death penalty murders for every single one that was. And so these failed outcomes, and let's start with one that's called the 1 for 10 problem. There's a British journalist who came to America, very interested in the death penalty, and he found this very, very interesting number. And I would encourage you actually to go to this website if you're curious in following it. It's called 1 for 10. And it has this number, and this number is fairly shocking. For every 10 people executed in the United States, 1 has been set free. Not set free in terms of just spending the rest of their life in another jail. Absolutely walk out the door innocent. Did not commit the crime. 1 for 10. I want you to think about that for a minute. That's a government failure rate that's pretty extreme. If somebody didn't come pick up your trash every 11th week, you'd be pretty angry. If every 11th day you went to turn on your water and it didn't work, if your water, your city water system had that level of failure rate, people would be demanding change. If your newspaper didn't show up every 11th day, you would demand change. And so it has always been astonishing to me that we have that level of failure rate, but people are not marching down to our courthouses demanding change, because that is an extraordinary failure rate. And it's not the only failure rate we need to be aware of. Many, many prosecutors regularly publish annual reports that talk about success rates, conviction rates, and they'll say, we have a 90% conviction rate. And what they're telling you is that 90% of the time, the person that they have charged with a crime is being convicted of the highest level crime they've been charged with. They may plea bargain lessers, but they're saying 90% of the time I charged this person with burglary, they were convicted of burglary by plea or by trial. That's their measure, not mine. That is a measure that is commonly, you go to ask a prosecutor, every single prosecutor in the state, all 88 can tell you their conviction rate. Any given day, they can tell you what that number is. That's their number, not mine. Let's look at that then. When you look at the death penalty, the charge, if they're going to be successful by their own measure, means that they should be getting a death verdict. How often do they get a death verdict for every 100 death penalty cases they bring? 5%. 95% of the time, by their own measure, they are not achieving the outcome they claimed, that this crime was so heinous, so horrible, the worst of the worst. 95% of the time, they're wrong. There are problems, and this is what we sat down with. And I commonly tell people, look, if the government's failing at something 95% of the time, perhaps we should stop. But that wasn't our charge, once again. But this was the data we knew. We knew when we sat down at the table. We knew. These are uncontroverted numbers. I brought up all of this data at the table. There were prosecutors at this table. The Attorney General had a representative at the table. There were judges who across the spectrum from very conservative, what you might think of as hanging judges, to more liberal judges. We had the whole spectrum. We had professors at the table. This was a representative community of people who worked in the justice system, who had deep experience with the death penalty, who had worked around it, and not one time did anybody ever bring a single set of data, a single study, a single report that controverted anything I just told you. And so what we sat down with was the uncontrovertible evidence that the death penalty in Ohio is absolutely unfair as the process exists today. And so we started our process of examining what recommendations we could make to change it. As I said, we did it without enough data. I wish we had more, but we did make 56 recommendations, each and every one of them designed to address one of those geographical disparities, racial disparities, outcome problems, witherspooning issues, all of those, the personal predilections of the prosecutors. Every single recommendation we made addresses one of those problems. Every single one. People commonly say, well, Tim, that's a lot of recommendations. Which ones should we really take up? All of them. Every single one of them. What do you mean, which one should we take up? All of them. We didn't spend 2 years debating useless topics. We didn't spend 2 years going, you know what, these are the 3 really important ones. Let's spend 18 months talking about 53 really unimportant ones. 56 really important recommendations. They ranged across the board, and let me just give you an example of things that we did recommend. The report is available online. Anybody who wants it, the Supreme Court has it posted on their website, fairly easy to find. If you can't find it, don't hesitate to email me, contact me. I'm more than happy to provide it to you. I'm sure Abe also would. But we made a number of recommendations. One of them, get rid of felony murder. And this requires some explanation. The death penalty is not eligible for all murders. The death penalty has always been defined for the worst of the worst. What are the most heinous murders? What are the worst murders? Not all murders are the worst murders. I understand all murder is bad. We can all agree on all murder is bad. All murders are not the worst murders. By definition, some have to be worse than others. And when you start with that, you have to start examining, what do we give the death penalty for? What kinds of crimes are eligible for the death penalty? If not all murders, then only specific types of murders. To give you examples, murder of a child. If you're gonna have the death penalty, I guess that one makes sense. 5 children. I'm gonna be a little soft there. Multiple murders, if you kill more than one person at the same time. If you murder a police officer. But we also have this class of things called felony murder. Somebody comes in here with a gun and says, I'm going to rob you. Give me your wallet. Give me your purse. Give me your cell phone. That's called an aggravated robbery. If they shoot you in the course of that, that's a felony murder. They've committed a murder in the course of an aggravated felony. The 5 types of felony murder in Ohio are aggravated robbery, aggravated burglary, arson, kidnapping, and rape. And what we found is, when we did the studies, that last study we did in 2012, is that when you look at murder and connect the death penalty with the specific type of specification that exists, first and foremost, the conviction rates in the felony murder realm are about 2%. Really, really bad. So for every 100 people charged with the death penalty for an aggravated robbery murder, 2 receive a death verdict. 98% of the time, the prosecutor or a jury says no. That's after they've decided this was the worst of the worst. The other thing we found was there was a dramatic increase in race bias involved in felony murder decisions, and a dramatic increase in geographical bias involved in felony murder. So the recommendation was, get rid of it. You can eliminate both geographical bias and race bias at a fairly high level. You're not going to eliminate it from our system. You're just not. But you can reduce it significantly by simply getting rid of those as choices. One, they're not being used much anymore. When you talk about a 2% rate, that compares to multiple murder victims, which is the highest rate, which runs at about 36 to 40%. So you take 100 cases where multiple people have been killed, 36 to 40% of the time the person will receive the death penalty if they were charged with a death penalty specification. 36 compared to 2. It's a very dramatic difference. The most racist charge in Ohio that receives the death penalty? Rape. You can't get the death penalty for rape. There's a misconception there. It's for murder while committing a rape. So when somebody, obviously almost always a woman, is being raped and ultimately is killed, that is felony murder that comes out of a rape. But it is the most racist form that we have. Why do I say that? Well, when you look at the numbers, 25% of the time when the victim was white, death verdict was imposed. How many times do you suppose when the victim was black was a death verdict imposed? We have a winner. 0. 0. Not once did a jury find it worthwhile to impose the death penalty when the victim of the crime was black. It is the most racist charge we have in terms of outcomes that include the death penalty. So that was one recommendation we made. We also said that there should be a recommendation that there should be a Racial Justice Act. Makes sense. You should be allowed to collect statistical data, and if you can show a racial bias in charging patterns or other patterns that led to the result in your case, you shouldn't receive the death penalty. We're not saying you should be set free, but we should certainly get rid of the death penalty if race had some substantial impact in the outcome of your case, and if we can prove it through statistical data collection, you should be allowed to do so. Makes sense? One, again, we need to address race. We should also mandate that all death penalty homicides should be centrally reported. We should never be sitting in a room again going, gee, we don't have a lot of data about this. We need to have good data from here and forever forward. We need to know exactly what's going on, because if we don't keep track of it, we're just going to keep sliding backwards into these huge disparities that I've already listed for you. Another big area that we discussed was mental health. The seriously mentally ill. Should we really be executing people who are seriously mentally ill? And you'll hear from people, oh, we already have protections for that. We have not guilty by reason of insanity, or we have incompetence. I need to tell you that the law really sucks on mental illness. You take 100 people who the average citizen, or even a psychotherapist, a psychologist, a psychiatrist would say, yes, seriously mentally ill, the law would find perhaps 2 of them incompetent to stand trial and maybe 5 of them not guilty by reason of insanity. The law defines insanity in such a very, very narrow way that it does not encompass people who have severe depression, bipolar, schizophrenic. There are people who are actively schizophrenic who are not insane according to the law, which is in itself a little insane. So you have these huge issues that we should never be imposing the ultimate punishment on people who have some sense of diminished capacity. That's just mean. There is just a sense of real meanness to picking on a group of people. And when I say that knowing that about half, if not far more than half, of death row today has serious mental illness. There are those who say it's as high as 80 or 90%. I will stand here and tell you I have zero doubt that half of death row is easily diagnosable with a severe mental illness today. Half. That's 75 men on death row today. What you don't see in the death penalty is the imposition on somebody who's completely sane, white, and middle class, except in the rarest of rarest instances. We impose the death penalty upon poor people who have had incredibly troubled lives, largely minorities, although not exclusively in any way, but you don't ever see it being imposed upon people who don't have those strikes, if you will, going in. We also want real basic things. One recommendation, maybe we should have all crime labs in Ohio, I don't know, accredited. I know, seems kind of obvious, doesn't it? We debated that one for like 3 days. There was actually debate on that, whether they should be accredited, whether the blood or any other bodily fluid should be tested in an accredited lab, a lab that has passed basic functioning of how you do a scientific test. Gee, I think that's only fair. I think every case should be tested only in accredited labs, but at a minimum, all death penalty cases should be. Seems simple. There's actually a debate on whether we should even take that one up. Stunning to me. That we should fund the death penalty on a statewide basis. Do you know today, based upon home rule, there are counties that pay as little as $6,000 to defense counsel for representing somebody in a death penalty case? $6,000. That's ridiculous. The ceiling my office authorizes for death penalty representation is $75,000. Just to give you an idea of what we think is even remotely fair. I honestly think that number should probably be much closer to $150,000 to $200,000. There are budgetary issues involved in some of those decisions, but 6 is just silly. Most counties, the number is $25,000 for 2 lawyers, 12 and a half each, 25 grand. Most death penalty cases will require 6 months of a lawyer's life if they do it right. 6 months full time, 12 and a half grand. That means that lawyer is going to make about $25,000 a year. That means the lawyer is working for poverty. Poverty in America to represent somebody who is charged with the death penalty. These are just really basic fundamental flaws that people talk about. Yes, we should have a death penalty. We shouldn't have a death penalty under a system like that. You have to address these things. We should have litigation fund not just to pay lawyers, but for all capital costs, the lab fees, experts. Given how many people on death row have serious mental illness, perhaps we should be testing, I don't know, some basic mental functioning. We should be doing basic function. To do a really good analysis of somebody, it's $5,000 to hire a very good psychiatrist to come in and do the battery of tests you really want done. $5,000 to walk in the door. Cuyahoga County passed a cap of $3,000 for all expert fees. Everyone, everything you need, $3,000. That's one of the richer counties in this state. $3,000. No, you don't need more. You don't need all those tests. Science. It'll get in the way, right? We've got things to do. So I have gone on and on and on, and I can go through all 56, and I promise you I'm not going to. I just want to give you a flavor of the kinds of recommendations that we made and the reasons why we made them, because I think it's fundamental, more important than the actual recommendations, to understand why we made them. Because if you understand the system has this value of life problem, if you understand the system has this race outcome problem, if you understand the system has this massive geographical disparity problem and has this failure rate problem, then you start to accept, I don't care who you are, in favor of the death penalty, not in favor of the death penalty, we can all agree the system doesn't work and we should change it if we're going to continue down this course. And so the work of the task force is vitally important if Ohio wants to continue on the path that it does. And it does today. As Abe mentioned, our Ohio legislature is probably not anywhere close to considering getting rid of the death penalty. So if we're going to continue it, then we need to approach our legislators. We need to talk to them and make sure they understand it's not about, oh, yes, we must have it, or no, we shouldn't have it. It's got to be about, if we have it, we have got to fix these things. And that means you take up all 56 recommendations and implement them immediately before the next case is prosecuted, before the next person is charged, before the next person in this state is executed. Thank you.